Today on State of Independence, we'll meet a man who explored Reagan's spiritual life and found a roadmap to his enduring connection to the American people. Stay with us. There's a process of making ordinary people into heroes and legends that seems to leave out the details that make a leader accessible. After the death of a great woman or man, there's always a race to find the real leader underneath the portrait or statue. Family members fight for a standard that leaves out the difficult pieces that don't support the myth. Colleagues fight for book deals, claiming the title for who was closest, who was in the know, or who was in the room for the big decisions. And the leaders themselves often leave a crumb trail of clues that take historians away from the hard places of trial and difficulty while pointing them to the highlights. But the biggest clues to how a leader made decisions or how they saw the world was their view of God, their understanding of man's nature, their belief or denial of eternity, even their understanding of good and evil. Dr. Paul Kengor poured over tens of thousands of pages, photos, videos, and audio recordings to find what Ronald Reagan really believed about God and how he saw the world. We'll meet Dr. Kengor in a minute, but first, watch this.
When a group of President Reagan's strongest admirers launched an international effort to preserve his legacy, they set out to enshrine his name and likeness on airports, elementary schools, highways, public buildings and squares, and even warships. Their goal was to name one notable public landmark in each of America's counties after the 40th president. To date, there are 151 landmarks scattered across America and memorials in 168 locations around the world. But for a generation of young Americans, the real Reagan, like Washington or Lincoln, is becoming almost unreachable, a symbol for ideas like peace, freedom, and human dignity, but no longer a real person. So who was Ronald Wilson Reagan? Who was the man when the curtain closed on his celebrated life? Was there an inner life that animated the persona, that radiated kindness, openness, and optimism? A Reagan biographer chased these questions and found answers.
Dr. Paul Kengor is the Senior Director for the Institute for Faith and Freedom College and a political science professor at Grove City College. He's researched and written extensively about one of America's most examined presidents, Ronald Reagan. But he's one of the only ones to go beyond the simple outlines of his political views and the triumphant American story. Welcome, Dr. Kengor. It's great to have you on State of Independence. How are you?
Thank you, Joe. Good. I'm a longtime fan, and so it's good to finally meet you. And I really appreciate you doing this topic. And that was a wonderful video there. That so many people do not appreciate this about Ronald Reagan. So thank you for asking me to speak on it.
Yeah, well, of course, when people die, they become larger than life. And, Ronald Reagan, before he was president, was a movie star. So, people saw him in the movies, and you know how Americans hold movie stars. I mean, we hold them in awe. And so from movie star to governor to president of the United States, what a remarkable unlikely, I think, when he was in the TV business that he would ever become a governor, and even more unlikely that he would become president of the United States, because most people considered that he'd be too old to be president by the time he ran.
Right. Yeah, imagine that, right? So, I mean, he was in an era of Biden and Donald Trump, both well into their 70s. So Ronald Reagan was 69 years old when he was elected in 1980. In fact, when he lost his challenge to Gerald Ford in 1976, and I talked to a bunch of different people who witnessed this, Mike Reagan's sister Maureen, and others. In fact, Ronald Reagan saw Maureen and his daughter from the first marriage to Jane Wyman, and she was crying. And he said, "You're still crying?" And she said, "Yeah, Dad, everybody says you're going to be too old to run in 1980. This is it. You lost in 76. This is it." And Ronald Reagan said to her, he said, "No, God has a plan." I mean, he saw everything providentially. Wow. He said, there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this. And I talked to Michael Reagan about this a number of times. He talked to Margaret Thatcher about it. Margaret Thatcher said to him, boy, just think what your dad could have done if he would have, what we could have done if he would have won 4 years earlier. Mike said, no, 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 no. If he would have won in 76 and 1980, Mrs. Thatcher, you wouldn't have been in yet. Pope John Paul II wouldn't have been in yet. Mikhail Gorbachev came in 1985. Reagan would have missed all of Mikhail Gorbachev, even if he won 2 terms in 76 and 80. And Ronald Reagan would look back at all of it after 1989 and say, God had a plan. I was not supposed to win in 1976. It wasn't the right time. 1980 was. And like you said, Joe, I mean, he was really already kind of larger than life. The guy he was a movie star in the days when movie stars were really movie stars, right? I mean, he came out of the golden age of Hollywood in the 30s and 40s and actually made a lot of A movies. People called him a B movie actor. It was very unfair. I mean, he made movies with all the big stars. And when he won in 1980, I mean, think about this in terms of the election we just had. So Joe Biden's margin of victory over Donald Trump, I don't know what's the latest, maybe 3-4 million votes, probably more than that. But Ronald Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in 1980, an incumbent. Reagan won 44 out of 50 states. He won the Electoral College 489 to 49. He won the overall vote percentage 51 to 41. And then he was reelected in 1984 by winning 49 out of 50 states.
Yeah, big margin.
And winning the Electoral College 525 to 13. So in many ways, he was indeed a larger than life figure prior to the presidency, and really even during the presidency. We haven't had anybody that popular.
You've written this wonderful book about God and Reagan, and I'm just fascinated that you're fascinated by him. I think so many of us are. But he's a bit of an enigma. I mean, so here's a guy who, on the one hand, makes a statement like this, that, God's timing, that God wasn't ready for me to be there yet. Here's a guy but then he also doesn't go to church. He's not like he's not a big churchgoer. He's not affiliated with a denomination. He's not somebody who has spent lots of time, in the church world. Yet and still he seems to have what is clearly a deep and abiding and sincere faith in God.
Well, that whole episode, that's part of the divine plan too, and Reagan called it the DP. In fact, Bill Clark, who was Reagan's closest friend and advisor, I was Clark's biographer, so I knew Clark really well. He and Reagan had an acronym for everything, and they actually called it the DP, the divine plan. And in fact, Bill, Joe, he would say to me all the time, "Oh, it was the DP, Paul, the DP." And I'd say, "The DP?" He said, "Yeah, the divine plan, the divine plan." But Ronald Reagan, what happened, so he attended church his entire life. In fact, this had been really put in him by his mother. And likewise, this sense of divine providence, divine plan. She used to tell him all the time, she'd say, "Ronnie, even everything that happens to you, even the bad things, these are all part of God's plan. God is doing this for a divine purpose to bring good out of this." And he went to church his entire life. Even when he got to D.C., he joined the National Presbyterian Church, which was pastored by the Reverend Louis Evans, who I interviewed him shortly before he died. The associate pastor, John Boyles, who's still with us, who knew Ronald Reagan well. He actually went to church almost every week of his first 6 or 7 weeks in the presidency in 1981 until the assassination
until
attempt.
He was shot.
March 30th, 1981.
Yeah.
And that changed everything. And by the way, he believed there too that God had spared him. And he told this to a bunch of people. And I probably interviewed a dozen people who talked to him and said, "Oh yeah, he told me this." Reagan said that, he said, "I believe that God has spared my life for a special purpose." And he believed that purpose was to take on and confront the Soviet Union and defeat atheistic Soviet communism. But the reason why he quit attending church after that was that going to church became just this enormous security fiasco where they would wand everybody who came in. Everybody had to go through metal detectors. There were SWAT guys on the roofs outside, helicopters swirling around. I mean, this was the year that Anwar Sadat in Egypt
was killed. Assassinated, right?
Yeah, assassinated during a
So
military parade. Yeah.
what is hard for me to figure out is, political campaigns love to make hay of what they think are the strengths of their candidates. Certainly, Jimmy Carter made it one of the central points when he ran in 1976 of his campaign that he was a person of faith, that he was a born-again believer. And Reagan had this clearly deep and abiding faith, clearly something that Americans didn't know about. They knew him as a movie star, then as governor of California, as a leader of the conservative cause, but they didn't know him as a person of faith. And here it was, the 1980s were a time when the moral majority came to light and became a powerful force in the country. Why did his handlers and campaign advisors not use his faith as yet another weapon in their arsenal to kind of strengthen his appeal to Americans?
Yeah, he didn't want it to be used that way. And it was really much a natural part of him. In fact, I found an interview that he did, and I think it was 76. And he was asked about his relationship with God. And he said, all the kind of standard language. Yes, Christ is my Lord and Savior. I pray, I read the Bible. And I think too, Joe, that in those days, it was just more understood that there was this culture of Christendom in America. And, pretty much every man, is usually men, right, who ran for the office of the presidency in those days, you could pretty much assume that they were by and large people of faith. So it was very much a part of him. What happened during the 1980s was you would have liberals in particular who would try to point to the hypocrisy of Ronald Reagan, right? They would say, oh, well, he's not going to church on a regular basis, and here are the moral majorities standing behind him. Or when they found out that Nancy consulted astrologers, which she did, and they said, oh, yeah, what kind of a person of faith would be married to a woman who consults astrologers?
She wasn't really a person of faith like he was. I mean, as I understand it, I mean, she certainly loved her husband. There's no doubt about that. But she did not seem to be a person necessarily of a strong faith, a strong abiding faith. Is that fair to say?
She's even more of an enigma than he is. In fact, at this point, he's not an enigma on faith. It's very clear now where he stood. But with Nancy, and in my book, God and Ronald Reagan, I have a full chapter on Reagan's church attendance, Reagan and astrologers. Believe it or not, this is also connected to the assassination attempt. So I could talk about this for an hour. I'll try to sum it up briefly, but Nancy was very much a sort of California Hollywood person. And by the way, in those days, almost everybody in California read their horoscope. I know that seems weird to people today, but they did. And after the assassination attempt, she got a call from a Hollywood friend, and the Hollywood friend was Merv Griffin. And he told her, he said, Nancy, I want you to know that my friend, and his friend was Joan Quigley, the famous astrologer, called me and told me that this was a really bad day for Ronnie. He should have avoided all public appearances. It was a dangerous day. And Joe, her exact response, she wrote this in her memoirs. Her exact response was, oh my God, she used those words, right? I could have stopped this, right? I could have stopped the assassination attempt on my husband if I would have followed these charts. And Nancy later said, she said, do I believe in it? Is Joan right? Is this stuff true? I don't know, but I was going to do everything within my powers to protect my Ronnie, to protect my husband. Then I talked to Bill Clark about this. Bill Clark was Reagan's chief of staff in California. They were constantly getting threats of assassination against Reagan in the late 60s. I remember the late 60s. Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., George Wallace, right? All these assassinations, John F. Kennedy. So they were constantly, and Bill told me, he said, Nancy was a worrywart. She was always afraid that her husband was going to get assassinated. She had nightmares about it. And so when an astrologer friend called, and Nancy was a Christian, she was indeed a Christian. But when somebody called and said, hey, Nancy, I think I know something here other people don't know. If you consult my friend Joan, she can help protect Ronnie. And she went for it. She latched onto it. That's what she did. She's
a loving wife, caring about her husband, not knowing what to do.
I don't approve, but you don't approve too, and we shouldn't approve as Christians. But that's where she was. And by the way, this is classic Ronald Reagan. When he found out about it, he said to Nancy, honey, who was that? And she said, well, it's this person, Joan. and she's an astrologer. And this is classic Reagan. He didn't yell at her. He didn't call her an idiot. He didn't tell her she was going to hell, right? He said, well, it's kind of odd. If it makes you feel better, okay, but you probably shouldn't talk about this much and let this get out. But it got out, and when it got out, it was people ridiculed her, mocked her for it. Understandably so.
Yeah. So here you have this president, this marvelous president who still fascinates me as he fascinates you. Clearly, did the Bible and his faith have anything to do with the decisions he made as president? I mean, real live political decisions?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And I mean, he could give you his favorite verses, Old Testament, New Testament.
How about Star Wars? Wars?
Well, let me say this. I think I love the title of your show, by the way. State of Independence is brilliant. And it ties right into this. He really admired, Reagan did, the founding fathers, the state of Pennsylvania, what had happened here in Pennsylvania, 1776. And Reagan said this, I find this fascinating. I mean, you're probably literally not far from Valley Forge. Reagan said the most sublime image in American history is the image of George Washington on his knees, praying in the snows of Valley Forge. And he said, because for Reagan, that personified the idea of America, that we as a people should go to our Creator. We should go on our knees to our Creator. And Reagan had a favorite quote from Lincoln. He said, I'm often driven to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I have nowhere else to go. Right? I'm often driven to my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I have nowhere else to go. And Reagan felt that way. He said both Washington and Lincoln personified a people who believed that you needed to humble yourself. And it's interesting because you'll get this from secular liberals all the time who want to call Christian people arrogant or self-righteous. It's just the opposite. As George W. Bush said, as a Christian, I believe somebody is watching me. I believe that I'm accountable for my actions. If I do or don't go into Iraq, I could be held accountable someday for that by my Creator before the pearly gates, right? A God who condemns me for acting or not acting, right? So it's about people who humble themselves and look to a higher authority. It's the atheist who looks only to himself, right? The believer actually says, I think somebody out there is watching me. I better consult my Bible. I better consult my scripture. I better get on my knees. I better pray to God for guidance. And that was something that Ronald Reagan understood.
Powerful. Don't go anywhere. When we come back, I'll ask Professor Kengor about a remarkable letter that Ronald Reagan wrote to his dying father-in-law. So stay with us.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
Professor Kengor, this is fascinating to learn about President Ronald Reagan and to really get the inside because most people don't know this. What an incredible human being he was. I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about this letter. This is something that obviously you know about, but a few years ago, a reporter researching Nancy Reagan discovered a 4-page handwritten letter that President Reagan wrote to his dying father-in-law, Loyal Davis, Nancy Davis's stepfather. And here's some of what he wrote in that letter. So listen to this, and then I want you to react to it. Loyal, that's the father-in-law, you and Edith have known a great love, more than many have been permitted to know. That love will not end with the end of this life. We've been promised this only a part of life, and that a greater life, a greater glory awaits us. It awaits you together one day, and all that is required is that you believe and tell God you put yourself in His hands. And then he writes, we have been promised that, this is President Ronald Reagan writing this, by the way, we have been promised that all we have to do is ask God in Jesus' name to help when we have done all we can, and when we've come to the end of our strength and abilities, and we'll have that help. We only have to trust and have faith in His infinite goodness and mercy. Amazing words by an
It's
American
amazing.
president.
Yeah. While Reagan was president, and he's pausing to write a letter like that, and his father-in-law was a conservative. He was
A
a
medical
surgeon,
doctor, right? Also a medical
medical
doctor.
doctor, and he was an atheist. And here's Ronald Reagan concerned first and foremost about his soul. And I found many letters like that over the years. In fact, I remember the first one that really struck me. It was a letter to a Methodist minister of all things, who was having concerns or questions about the divinity of Christ.
Ronald Reagan wrote a letter to a Methodist minister.
Yeah, the minister was having doubts, right? And the minister is arguing with Ronald Reagan. This is a liberal minister, and he's arguing with Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan said, "Well, it seems to me he really didn't give us a choice. Either he would be a liar, lord, or lunatic." Right? And I read that and I thought, whoa, C.S. Lewis's liar, lord, or lunatic argument. And by the way, this shows too, I think, the importance of having scholars who are Christians do work like this, because I think maybe other Reagan biographers might have seen that letter before and just ignored it, right? But I saw it and I said, whoa, this is C.S. Lewis's liar, lord, or lunatic argument that Reagan is using here.
Nobody would know this about Ronald Reagan. Nobody would even suspect that he would be engaging people like this in this kind of way. I mean, this is wonderful to hear.
And he wrote hundreds of letters like that. And in fact, I filled up a chapter with examples where at one point we just footnoted the remainder of the letters, but he would read in the newspaper about this policeman who was killed in New Jersey. And just out of like this act of kindness, he wrote a letter to the widow and said, and the widow's just surprised to get, at that point, he was like governor of California, saying things like, well, you don't know what God's plan is, what God's providence is. I know this is hard to accept right now, but maybe there is a reason for this. So all the time he's working on people one-on-one. And with that letter, Joe, that you just read to Loyal Davis, his father-in-law, there he is. He's president of the United States. And of all things, he pauses in the middle of a very, very, very busy day, like all these days were, to write this long, heartfelt letter because he's worried about his father-in-law's soul. And a lot of us wouldn't even do that, right? We'd say, well, I'm praying for the guy and it's really in the Lord's hands. And I've tried over the years. We had arguments at Thanksgiving or Christmas about God, and Loyal's about to pass on, so be it. No, Ronald Reagan stopped and he wrote this in a letter, and he wanted Loyal Davis to see this. He wanted to save the man's soul.
That's one. I mean, this is so wonderful to hear, because presidents, more than anybody else, you would think would have the right to say that they're self-consumed, consumed with themselves,
right.
And all that their office brings with it. But yet and still, here's an American president who, when he was governor as well as president, is engaging people, his neighbors, because he's loving them like he loves himself, and he's taking time to write them personal notes and to encourage them. And certainly in the case of Loyal Davis, to help him find the path that leads to eternal life in the closing hours of his life, to bring Loyal Davis to a saving knowledge of Christ. I mean, what a marvelous thing. What can this teach us? At least, what can this teach the next president of the United States about faith and how it might be articulated?
Well, I'd say first and foremost to remember, especially if you're a Christian president, that Christ comes first. Your Christian faith comes first, and no matter what your obligation is to your country and to the rest of the world, you still have that very fundamental duty to love thy neighbor as thyself, right? And to reach out to the people around you. And you never stop being a Christian. You never stop evangelizing. You never stop trying to save souls. And I know we're running out of time, but I'll just say this very quickly. Ronald Reagan said this about the evil empire speech as well. He said the individual is more important than the state. Why? Because the individual is a human being made in the image of God, the imago Dei. And because of that, we have souls. We have souls. Individuals are eternal. States are not. States, countries, empires come and go. But the individual is eternal. So Reagan believed that the state could not trump the individual. There is nothing more important than the individual.
So well said. Thank you so much, Professor Kengor. Thanks for being with us on State of Independence.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this, Joe. Take care.
Stay with us.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
What an amazing discussion with Professor Paul Kengor. Now we're going to talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well, wow, once again, I mean, what a really fascinating conversation. And for someone who, as a historian, is able to take a look at the facts and see not just what's there in black and white, or see the obvious, that this was not a person in President Reagan playing a role. He embodied the ideals. And we're in a period in our country where we're actually debating whether a leader has to have real belief or if they just have to act a certain way while they are in office to please one side or the other. I think it's conclusive that belief matters, what a leader reads matters, if a leader prays or how they believe it. I'm not saying it's a litmus test, but we should know how a leader approaches life and sees the world.
Yeah, a lot of them have been shaped not only by their successes but by their tragedies.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that plays into some of it. I think for those who've had more difficult challenges in their life, maybe it's been easier for them to lean on their faith, or at least and to talk about their faith. You know, Ronald Reagan had a difficult childhood, I think, and an
alcoholic father, you know, dragging him in from the snow, all of these scenes that we know as part of the Reagan biography. But then a divorce.
Yeah.
I mean, he did not want a divorce, and to think that, I'm sure he was thinking, this is it, this is over. Then to experience grace and a marriage that now famously was one that many people say is a standard for marriage.
Yeah, he had such a loving relationship with his wife. She loved him and cared for him so deeply. What a marvelous thing.
It's great. Great show.
Yeah, great show. Well, thank you for joining us on State of Independence. We hope today's conversation with Professor Paul Kengor gives you hope and encourages you to trust God with all of your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as you love yourself. If you have a minute, I'd love to know what you think of this program. You can comment at joewatkins.net. I see and respond to almost every one of your emails as best I can. So from America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. Thanks so much for watching.
Did you ever see Reagan in person?
I did, but I saw him giving a speech. He was a marvelous speaker, marvelous communicator, and he had such stage presence.
Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.